My name is Alina Brooks. I am 32, female, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina in a brick townhouse that faces a line of crepe myrtles and a pool that opens Memorial Day and shuts the last Sunday of September. I work weekdays as an office coordinator for a pediatric clinic near South Boulevard, and I run a licensed cottage catering business on nights and weekends called Second Spoon. I carry a small blue binder with tabs for permits, invoices, menus, and food safety logs. I like lists that start with wash hands and end with lights off and door locked. I married Marcus 3 years ago after we met at a church picnic when he burned hot dogs, and I showed him how to move them to the cool zone. He said I saved the meat, and I said it was practice. I feed people when I do not know what else to do. If you come to my home, you leave with leftovers wrapped in foil and a note on the container that says, "Heat at 350 for 10 minutes." My mother taught me that food is both care and boundary. You offer it with respect, and you do not let people treat your kitchen like a trash can. Marcus's mother is named Denise, and she does not believe in boundaries. She believes in order, as long as it is her order. She lives 6 minutes away in a wider house with a sunroom full of fake plants and a sign that says, "Family is everything as long as family agrees." She calls her oldest daughter her rock, and her son Marcus, her heart, and me, her help. When she thinks I cannot hear, I have heard it enough times to know she thinks it is clever. She likes to say, "Black attire for help at events." She likes to say, "Smile, darling, this is not about you." I smiled even when my jaw ached because Marcus looked tired when I did not. I told myself I would be polite until politeness turned into silence that hurt me. The problem started to grow the week she planned her 60th birthday. She booked the HOA clubhouse at their subdivision because she likes polished floors and a fireplace that is not hooked to anything, and a wall where she can project a slideshow of her best angles. She came to my house on a Thursday and placed a thin list on my counter. It said, "Food and drinks and clean up," and wore a smile like a trap. She said, "We will have 90 guests, so nothing too fussy. We will do brisket sliders, mac and cheese, salad, fruit, and a tiered cake. No pork on account of Aunt Lou," she said. And then she tapped the last line that said, "Help wear black and be in the kitchen." I picked up the paper and said, "Denise, are you asking me to cater your party?" She laughed and said, "Oh, sweetie, not cater. Just help. You know how you do. You can manage the food so we do not have to hire anyone. You are not a guest. You are family. You always say you love to cook." I said, "I do love to cook. I do not love to be told I am help and not invited to sit down." She smiled, but her eyes were cold, and she said, "Do not be sensitive. It is a family event." And then she said, the sentence that became my fuel. She said, "You are help, not family. You should wear black, so you do not stand out in photos." I took a breath like I had learned to do when a child in our clinic screamed during a vaccine. Slow in and slower out. I said, "Denise, we need to be clear. I run a licensed cottage kitchen and a legitimate brand. I am permitted by the county and insured. I do not cook for free for 90 people. If you are asking me to cater, I can send you my menu tiers and a contract, and we can treat this like business. If not, then I will come as your daughter-in-law and take a plate and clap for the toasts and sit with my husband in a dress that is not black, if I do not want it to be." She laughed again and said, "My dear, that is cute. Do not bring up contracts with me. I did all the work for your wedding shower. I said you ordered a Subway platter and a sheet cake." She said, "And I paid for it." I said, "We sent you a thank you card and a gift." She said it was not enough. I put both hands on the counter so I would not shake, and I said, "Denise, you can choose. Hire me or host me. Not both." She snatched the list back and said, "We will handle it. You can bring ice." She picked up her purse and was out the door before I answered. When Marcus came home, I told him exactly what she said, and he rubbed his forehead and said, "You know how Mom is." I said yes, which is why I am drawing a line she can see. He said, "Maybe you can do a small part so she feels supported." I said, "I am not unpaid help." He said, "I know, but it will be easier." I said, "Easier for who?" He did not answer, and that hurt. That night, I sat at my dining table with my blue binder and my phone, and I looked up the HOA clubhouse rules. Because when a person says you are help and not family, you need to know the policies of the room where it will happen. On page 4, it said catered food must be provided by a vendor with certificate of insurance and a current county food safety certification. No exceptions. Outside food limited to dessert and chips unless approved. Renter responsible for damage cleanup and vendor compliance. I circled those lines in red pen and I felt a calm that tasted like cold water after running. The next morning, I called the clubhouse manager, a woman named Tasha, who has an eagle on her desk and a voice like a kind referee. I said, "My mother-in-law has booked your room for a party of 90. I run a licensed cottage catering company. Do you have a list of approved vendors?" She said, "We do, but we allow other licensed insured vendors with proper paperwork." I emailed her my certificate of insurance, my ServSafe manager card, and my county permit. She emailed back, "You are approved. If the host wants to serve anything beyond snack chips and store-bought cake, they need you or someone like you." And she asked if I was available that date. I said I could be. She said, "Send your menu and I will copy the host so she has it." I was careful. I typed a tidy 3-tier offer. Tier 1 buffet with 2 mains, 2 sides salad bread and water lemonade tea service. Tier 2 adds past bites and coffee. Tier 3 adds full staff service and rental coordination. I sent it with a note that said, "Happy to serve or happy to attend, but cannot do both." Denise replied with a single line, "We will not be needing vendors." Tasha replied with a longer line that quoted the policy and said to serve hot food, "You must have a vendor or cancel your hot food and keep it cold and simple." Denise replied with another line that said, "How hard can it be to warm sliders?" Tasha replied with the same policy again. I sat back and let the rule book do its work. I did not gloat. I stirred a pot of turkey chili and wrote on my list, "Buy extra chafing fuel for next month," because I had 2 other jobs lined up. 2 days later, my sister-in-law, her name is Britt, called me and said, "Mom is upset that you made this complicated. We were going to heat things in the kitchen and she says you told on her." I said, "I did not tell on anyone. I followed the rules. I am prepared to come as family or come as vendor." She said, "Fine. Can you at least make mac and cheese?" I said, "Not without a contract." She groaned and said, "You think you are a big deal now because you have a little LLC?" I said, "I think I am a professional and I keep my word by writing it down." She hung up. 3 more days went by and Denise texted me a screenshot of an Amazon order for sternos and disposable trays and wrote, "Solved?" I did not respond because it was not solved. Tasha emailed Denise again and copied me and wrote, "Reminder. Outside hot food service is not permitted. Please confirm your vendor by next Thursday, or the office will limit your event to light snacks per rules." Denise replied with a line of exclamation points. I ate a grape and smiled with my mouth closed. Marcus saw the emails and sighed and said, "Maybe you can step in and save the day at the last minute." I said, "I can step in if she hires me like a person and not like a sponge." He said, "I will talk to her." He talked and came back with a tight mouth and said, "She said you are making this about you." I said, "I am making this about policy and self-respect." He said, "I do not want to be between my wife and my mother." I said, "You are. You do not have to stay there." He looked at his shoes and said, "I hate this." I said, "Me too." The next Thursday at 4:12 p.m., my phone buzzed with a number I did not save. It was Tasha, and she said, "Alina, I just had a call from the host. She is angry and says her daughter-in-law is trying to ruin her party. I told her I am enforcing the rules." Then Tasha said, "Do you still have your date open?" I looked at my calendar with little blocks of color and saw a few bakery pickups that I could move, and 2 prep windows that would be tight, but possible. I said yes. Tasha said okay, because if she does not choose you, she has to choose someone else. But she asked if I would give her a deal because you are family. I said, "My family rate is respect at the same price as the public." Tasha laughed softly and said, "Send me your contract again and an estimate." I typed in a plain estimate. 90 guests. Tier 2. Brisket sliders with house sauce, smoked pulled chicken, mac and cheese with sharp cheddar and a Parmesan breadcrumb. Summer salad with strawberries, goat cheese, and pecans on the side. Roasted green beans with lemon, rolls, and butter. Sweet tea, lemonade water, coffee for after cake. Staff of 3 for 4 hours. Setup breakdown, rentals coordination, linens fee, insurance and service fee. Subtotal $2,950. Rush fee $100. Deposit due on signing $900. Balance due net 3 days. After event by check or card, I attached it to my standard contract with fields for signature and typed language that said texts confirming the order count as authorization. I sent it to Tasha, and she forwarded it to Denise with her firm sentence about compliance. At 8:03 that evening, I received a text from Denise. It said, "Fine, handle it and keep it simple." I replied, "I will proceed upon receipt of signed contract and deposit." She replied with one word, "Ridiculous." At 8:20, my phone pinged with an e-signature from Do Not Reply at the clubhouse portal. The host signature line held the shaky loops of Denise's name. At 8:22, my business account showed a $900 deposit paid by card. It came with a note that said, "Do not embarrass me." I exhaled and wrote in my blue binder, "Event confirmed," and I said out loud to my empty kitchen, "I will not." The next 10 days were a march of lists and food checks and vendor calls. I ordered brisket from a supplier I trust who smokes clean and cuts against the grain. I reserved 2 warming cabinets from a rental company. I hired 2 servers, Jasmine and Kay. Both are quick, quiet, and good with messy people. I wrote a timeline that started at 9 a.m. with pickup and ended at 10:30 p.m. with mop water down the drain. I printed it and stuck it with a magnet to my fridge. The problem did not go away. It shifted. Denise sent me a text that said, "Color scheme is champagne and pearl, so keep your staff in black." I wrote back, "My staff uniforms are black and white, and my apron is navy." She texted back, "Black only." I did not answer because I do not take wardrobe orders from someone who signed my contract without respect. The night before the party, Marcus sat on the couch and said, "I know you are right, but I am worried Mom will make a scene." I said, "I am worried about the food staying at 140 and the tea not getting watered down by ice. We are each doing our job." He half smiled and said, "I married a general." I said, "I married a man I want beside me, not behind me." He nodded and said, "I will back you up at the party." My chest loosened a notch. On the morning of the event, I put on my navy apron because it is the one with deep pockets that feels like armor. I tied my hair in a low bun. I checked the probe thermometer batteries. I loaded Cambros and bread. I picked up the meats and felt the hot weight through the insulated boxes and said, "Thank you," under my breath. I parked by the clubhouse service door, and Tasha opened it and said, "You look calm." And I said, "I am organized," which is how calm dresses. We set up the buffet in a T-shape, with the proteins closest to staff. I placed little label cards with neat handwriting, brisket sliders, house sauce mild, pulled chicken Carolina style, mac and cheese. I sprinkled the green beans with lemon zest at the last minute so they would pop. I showed Jasmine and Kay the flow and told them, Please and thank you are free, and we use a lot. At 4 o'clock, the first guests came, and at 4:15, Denise arrived in a glitter dress with a clutch and a face like a painting. She saw me and stopped, and then kept walking like the floor might break. She came to the service side of the table and said, "You need to stay in the kitchen." I said, "I am running service, which is here." She said, "You are ruining my vision." I said, "Your vision signed my contract." Tasha walked by and said, "Good evening, Miss Denise," and looked at me like she was an anchor. I lifted a pan lid and steam brushed my face, and I checked with the thermometer and saw 161 and nodded. People lined up, and the buffet moved like a slow river. I said, "Sliders on the left, please." I smiled and handed plates. I did not hide. I was not loud. I was steady. The guests ate and smiled, and a pastor asked me for the mac recipe, and I laughed and said, "Secrets are for people who lie. I will print it for you next time." Denise's sister told me the salad was perfect, and I told her I put pecans on the side because Aunt Lou does not do nuts, and she said, "You pay attention," and I said, "I do." 2 hours in, the cake arrived, and the bakery tried to roll it through the front. I redirected them to the service door. We cut and plated quickly. I poured coffee, and the room smelled like sweet butter, and those nights when my mother and I baked pound cake and she hummed. Marcus came and stood next to me and wiped a drip from the coffee urn and said, "You are doing great," and I felt seen. Then came the toast. Denise clinked a glass and said, "Thank you to everyone who came." She said, "I raised 2 wonderful children and I have wonderful friends." She did not say daughter-in-law. She said, "And thank you to my helpers for the food." She did not say my name or my business. A few people looked at me and I lifted my chin and smiled, because I will not let someone lower my head. After the toast, she came behind the table and hissed in a whisper, "You will not send me a bill." I said, "Denise, you signed a contract." She said, "I will call my bank." I said the deposit is non-refundable and the balance is net 3 days. She said, "I will tell everyone you are greedy." I said, "I will tell everyone I did my job." She pulled her glitter tight around her shoulders and said, "You are help, not family." I said, "Tonight I am a vendor and your words are a receipt." And I turned to refill a chafing dish because food does not wait for feelings. It should have ended there, with a clean service and a clean bill. But Act 2 does not give clean. At 8:30 p.m. The DJ played a slideshow, and Britt grabbed the microphone and made a joke about how some people will do anything to get attention, even set up a business to crash a party. A few laughs were mean. I felt heat crawl up my neck. And then I heard someone clap slow, and it was Marcus, and he said into the air, "Thank you, second spoon for tonight," and his voice cracked a little, and I almost cried into the green beans. Denise flashed him a look that would freeze open water, and the DJ faded the music too slow, and the room went weird. A man spilled tea near the coffee, and I mopped it while my cheeks burned. When it was done, and the rental company rolled out the warming cabinets, and the trash was bagged, and the last aunt took her centerpiece, I wiped the last crumb from the buffet and took off my apron and folded it in a square. I packed my Cambros and my labels and my little box of Sharpies and wrote the time in my log. 10:22 p.m. breakdown complete. I stood for a second in the quiet, and Tasha came and touched my shoulder and said, "You handled that with dignity." I said I handled it with practice. She said, "I wish the rule book could teach people manners too." I said, "Me too." I went home and slid the Cambros into their shelf and set my alarm for 6:30 to return the rentals. Then I sat at my desk and typed the invoice. I itemized everything with neat numbers and clear words. I attached the signed contract and the copy of the deposit receipt. I added a note at the bottom. "Thank you for choosing Second Spoon. Net 3. A 5% late fee applies after 5 days. It was modest because I am not petty. At 11:03 p.m. I emailed it to Denise and copied Marcus and Tasha. The subject line read, Invoice 1178. Denise's 65th. I hit send and felt the day drain out of me like a tub that finally finds the plug. The next morning at 7:11 a.m., a response came in. It said, "You will not see a dime from me. You humiliated me." I was already dressed in jeans to return rentals, and I sat on the edge of my bed and read the line again. I wrote back one sentence. "The contract you signed is attached again. Payment is due in 3 days." She wrote back, "Stop threatening me." I did not respond because contracts are not threats. They are promises. Marcus texted me and said, "Mom is going to fight it." I said, "I will send it to small claims if needed." He said, "I will try to talk to her." I said, "Do not be a rope in a tug of war. Be a post in the ground." He sent a thumbs up emoji and then later a message that said, "I am with you. Hold the line." Day 1 went by with silence. Day 2 brought a text from Britt that said, "You are evil for charging your own family." I put my phone face down and iced cupcakes for a different client and wrote their names with steady hands. Day 3 came and went with no payment. At 6:01 p.m., I clicked the late fee button and the total ticked up by $149.50. And I sent a polite reminder with an updated balance at 8:32 p.m. Denise replied with a photo of a shredded paper and wrote, "I threw your bill away." I saved the photo and filed it. On day 5, I filed a small claims case online for breach of contract. I attached the contract, the deposit receipt, the emails from Tasha about policy, the invoice, the text that said "Fine, handle it," and the photo of the shredded bill that made my attorney friend from church text me 3 words. "Thank you, evidence." The clerk sent a hearing date 3 weeks out. I printed it and slid it into my blue binder under a tab I had labeled Boundary. The night before the hearing, Marcus looked nervous and said, "Do you need me there?" I said, "You can be there as my husband and as someone who saw it. But you do not have to testify to your mother's character. We are not trying anyone's soul. We are presenting paper and words." He nodded and kissed my forehead and said, "I am proud of you." The morning of court, I wore a simple navy dress and low heels because dignity stands better when feet do not hurt. I brought a cooler bag with a water bottle and a granola bar because hunger makes people mean. I sat on a wooden bench and watched other people tell their stories with hands that shook and voices that raised. When our case was called, I said, "Yes, Your Honor." I stated my name, business, and the contract. I handed up the packet with a binder clip. The magistrate read in silence. Denise said I never hired her. She bullied me using the clubhouse. I said the clubhouse rules required a licensed vendor. The magistrate said I have those rules in the exhibit. He read the text where she wrote "Fine, handle it" and the signature page. And he said, "This is a contract." Denise said she is family. I said I am. And I am also a business owner. Those things are not enemies. The magistrate nodded like he understood that sentence because maybe he has a cousin who built fences and a sister who baked cakes. He said payment is due within 10 days per my order, plus court costs. He banged his small gavel and the sound was soft, but it was still a gavel. We walked out into the hallway and Denise said, "This is war." I said, "No, this is a receipt." She hissed and walked away, and Britt's heels clicked behind her like they were trying to stab the floor. The 10 days began, and I set a reminder on my phone for each one. On day 3, a check arrived in my mailbox with my name spelled Alina and a memo that said, "Greedy." I took a photo of it and deposited it by app and logged it. I did not reply because I save replies for people who mean well. When the money cleared, I transferred a portion to taxes and a portion to savings, and I closed the invoice with a satisfied click. That night, I made dinner for Marcus and me, roasted chicken with garlic, lemon, and rosemary. I set 2 plates and a small vase with clippings from the crepe myrtles, and we ate without a war. After we washed the dishes, he said, "Do you feel bad?" I said, "I feel tired and clean." like I went for a long run and came home. He said, "Mom is telling people you ambushed her." I said I followed the rules and gave choices, and she chose to sign. He said, "I know. I just hate that everyone is upset." I said, "Peace is not the same as silence. We chose peace. Let them choose whatever they choose." He nodded and we watched the pool lights blink on outside like quiet stars. The story could end there, but the low point had not yet finished teaching me. The week after the check cleared, Denise posted on Facebook that some brides of a certain local business should beware. She did not name me, but she used enough words that people could guess. I took a screenshot and filed it under nonsense. Then a stranger messaged my business page with a crude sentence, and I blocked and breathed. I almost took the website down and hid. I almost said, "This is too much. Let me focus on the clinic and stop this side work." And then I opened my blue binder and flipped through the tabs. Permits, menus, thank you notes with stains of barbecue sauce, the handwritten letter from a widower who said my chicken salad tasted like his late wife's, and he cried and laughed in his truck. A note from a teacher who said my cookies made her staff room smell like home. I held those pages like a quilt. I texted Tasha and said, "Has anyone else complained?" She wrote back 2 words, "Absolutely not." And then she said, "My cousin wants your card for her baby shower." I sat at my table with my face in my hands and let the fear shake out. And then I stood up and wrote a new menu line, lemon chess bars, because sweetness is a kind of muscle. The next Saturday, I catered a retirement party. The honoree gave me a hug that smelled like Old Spice and printer paper and said, "This is the best mac and cheese I have ever had." I said thank you and thought of lawyers and gavels and late fees and thought maybe it was worth it. 2 weeks later, I was at the grocery store when a woman in a peach blouse came up to me and said, "I am Denise's friend." I braced. She said I was at the party, and I watched the whole thing. "I want you to know you were professional," and she was unkind. I said thank you and meant it like a cup of water in August. I went home and iced a cake with smooth strokes, because practice makes smooth. I watched Marcus walk out to his car to go visit his mother, and he turned and said, "Want me to bring back your cake stand from her house?" My eyebrows went up. He smiled and said, "She has had it since Easter." I said, "Yes, please." He returned with the stand and a story. He said she ranted and then she stopped, and then she asked if I would like pork chops for dinner next week. I laughed and said, "Did you say no pork for Aunt Lou?" He said I did. We both laughed. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message I did not expect. It was from my father-in-law. His name is Gerald, and he keeps his words like pennies in a jar and spends them carefully. He wrote, "Thank you for making your invoices and rules clear. I plan events for our Rotary. And we need a caterer who shows up and does what she says and sends a bill when it is done. Call me Monday." I stared at the little gray bubbles on my screen and felt something like relief, mixed with pride. I set my phone down and leaned my head back on the couch and looked at the ceiling fan spin. I thought about how my mother-in-law called me help and not family, and how I catered the party and sent her the bill, and I thought about how revenge is sometimes a loud slap, but sometimes it is a quiet receipt that says paid in full. I closed my eyes and breathed. The worst had not broken me, it had sharpened me. Tomorrow I would meal prep chicken thighs for Monday because Monday always comes. And when it did, I would pick up the phone and say, "Hello, this is Alina with Second Spoon. How can I help you?" And I would mean help the way my mother meant it. An open hand with a clean glove, not a servant, a professional, a woman with a binder and a boundary and a plan. I woke up the next morning before the sun and the pool lights were still humming, and I stood at the sink with coffee and told myself to plan my week. Like a chef plans a service, I wrote lists for Monday to Friday, invoices to send, menus to price, a call to Gerald about the Rotary luncheon, a follow-up with the rental company about a scratched chafing lid so I could pay the small fee and keep my record clean. I packed Marcus's lunch, because peace at home starts with small kindness, and I set aside a container of lemon chess bars for my clinic coworkers, because sugar can soften a hard Monday. I drove to work, and the crepe myrtles threw shadows across the hood, and my phone buzzed with a message from Tasha that said the clubhouse board met, and they decided to add you to the preferred vendor list, and also to remind hosts to respect staff in writing. I smiled at the word respect, because it was spelled in a policy now, not just in my head. The day passed in small tasks and louder thanks. I filed vaccination records. I called insurance to chase a claim. I smiled at a toddler who hid behind his mother and then peeked out and handed me a sticker like it was a treasure. At lunch, I called Gerald. He said we need boxed lunches for a volunteer day, sandwiches, fruit, and a cookie. Nothing fancy but clean and on time. I asked for head count and delivery time and his budget, and he said, "We trust your judgment." I wrote the order in my blue binder, and he said, "I will mail a deposit." I said, "I also accept online payment," and he said, "Teach me," and I laughed and walked him through it, and he said, "Lord, technology." And then it came through with his name on it, and a note that said Rotary June event, and my chest warmed. I told myself this was how you replace noise with work, with paper that ends in a signature and a check that ends in a clear. I kept my head down and my hands clean, and yet the drama did not end because Denise did not know how to set it down. A week later, she called Marcus and told him she planned to host a smaller dinner for the cousins to make up for the party being ruined by me. He repeated her words, and I repeated the rules. He said, "I know." I told her the rules. She said it will be at her house so she can do what she wants. I said she can. And that means I do not have to attend if I am going to be treated like a pot on the stove and not a person. He looked at me like a man who wanted to argue, and then he looked at the blue binder and the way I had highlighted his own mother's signature, and he exhaled and said, "I am not asking you to cook. I am asking you to come as my wife." I said, "I will come if the tone is respectful, if she uses my name and not help, if she gives grace instead of glitter." He said, "I will tell her." He told her, and she sent me a text that said, "Please come and bring your spinach dip." I looked at the word please and the word spinach dip, and I wrote back, "I will bring my company and a small store-bought dessert because I am off duty." She responded with a single period like the end of a sentence, and I left it there. I bought a lemon pound cake at the bakery, run by my friend who ices roses like lace, and I put it on my reclaimed cake stand like a symbol that things come back. We went to the dinner, and the cousins were loud and happy, and the table smelled like rosemary, and someone had burned the rolls, and everybody laughed about it, like no one died. Denise looked at me and said, "Hello, Alina. Thank you for coming." Her face was still a fortress, but her words got across the bridge. I said, "Hello, Denise. Thank you for inviting me." She did not ask for a dip, and I did not offer. We made it through a meal without any speeches. This should have been the moment the story bent toward quiet, but week by week she tried to pull it back. She posted again online about small businesses that charge late fees and how terrible that is, and I printed the post and filed it under wind. She told a neighbor that I had made her cry, and the neighbor told me at the mailbox, and I said, "I am sorry." She cried, and I meant it. And I did not apologize for sending the bill. I learned a new sentence from the counselor that became a tool in my pocket. I said, "I can hold my boundary and still wish you comfort." I said it to myself while I kneaded dough, and it made the dough smoother. Summer became a rotation of event prep and clinic paperwork, and morning walks with Marcus when we had the same hour and wanted the same air. He became softer with the truth. He told his mother straight that she had been wrong. He told me straight when he was worried about finances and asked if we could sit with the numbers. We did. We looked at our budget like it was a recipe, and we salted the places we could. We cut out a streaming service and an impulse store run habit we both had. I raised my delivery fee by $5 across the board because gas prices rose, and I told my clients before the change and not after. And they nodded. I started a small sinking fund for the next food safety inspection, and it sat in my account like a quiet wall. Small Claims Court sent me a confirmation of satisfaction notice because the judgment had been paid, and that paper went under the tab labeled closure. I visited my mother for a weekend, and she cut up peaches at the counter and said, "I read your texts." And I held my tongue, because sometimes a mother must let her daughter fight her own war. I said, "Thank you for raising me to write things down," and she laughed and said, "You were writing grocery lists for your dolls when you were 8. We ate cobbler and watched a game show, and she said, "I am proud of you." I drove home with the windows down and cried at a red light in a good way. The climax came not at a party, but at a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, when I was in a rush because my chicken delivery was late, and I had to swap produce at the last minute, and my feet hurt in soft shoes. I turned a corner with my cart, and there was Denise standing by the rotisserie case. She was telling the clerk that the chicken skin looked dry and she wanted a discount, and the clerk was 19 with tired eyes. I stood for a second and watched the scene like a lesson. She saw me and stiffened and said, "Alina, tell this boy that this chicken is not worth full price." The boy looked at me like maybe I could save him. I walked forward and looked at the chicken, and I said, "It is within temperature, and it is the cost the store set. If it is not what you want, you can choose not to buy it." Her mouth tightened. She said, "You always side with strangers?" I said I side with fairness. "You taught me a lot about that." She said, "What did I teach you?" She was angry and curious at the same time. I said, "You taught me to put things in writing, to read rules, to send bills. You taught me that calling someone help is a way to make yourself feel big, and it fails every time." She opened her mouth and then closed it and shook her head. She said, "You embarrassed me in front of my friends." I said, "You embarrassed yourself when you ignored the rules and then you signed, because you thought you could scold your way out of the price." She said, "You are cruel." I said, "I am clear." Behind us, a woman coughed, and the rotisserie boy said, "Would you like the chicken or not, ma'am?" And she said no, and pushed her cart away. And I said to the boy, "You handled that fine." He said, "Thanks, ma'am." And then he smiled at me like he could breathe again. I left the store with lemons and parsley, and a feeling like the floor under me had clicked into place. At home, I zested the lemons into the aioli, and the smell lifted me. The Rotary luncheon came and went smooth as glass, and Gerald shook my hand and said, "I like how you run your ship." He booked me for 3 more dates and told the other clubs. I wrote quotes that were simple and fair and sent them like little flags I could plant in the calendar. Bookings grew. I hired Jasmine for regular hours, and she cried because she had been juggling too many jobs, and she wanted one that treated her like a person. I put her on the payroll with taxes and a clean stub, and she texted me a photo of her daughter's school shoes and wrote, "Thank you, Miss Alina." I went into my kitchen at night and thought, this is what revenge looks like in my life. Not screaming and not shutting down. It looks like hiring someone and paying them on time. It looks like a checklist with boxes I can check. The last hard part was the wedding. Britt got engaged fast to a man who liked his hair more than he liked listening, and she planned a wedding like a race. She told the family chat that vendors would be hired this time because she did not want any drama, and then she sent me a message that said, "I assume you will make the cake. Because/family." I read it 3 times, and then I wrote back congratulations, and I am available to bid like any other vendor. My cake schedule is packed through fall, so please send your date and your budget, and I can tell you if I can take it. She wrote back seriously. I did not respond because some questions are not requests for information, they are push pins. She hired a bakery in town, and then it fell through 2 weeks before because the baker had an emergency. She called me at 9:40 p.m. on a Wednesday. She was crying and said, "Please help me." I stood in the hall in my pajamas and felt the old tug to throw myself into the fire. I took a breath and asked her to repeat the date. I checked my calendar. I could do it if I moved a baby shower order and sent a message to that client with an apology and a small discount for changing delivery by 2 hours. I could do it if Britt signed and paid by noon tomorrow. I could do it if she chose a buttercream design I knew I could execute at volume. I said all those things. I said, I can help you like a vendor if you agree to my terms in writing. She was quiet, and then she said, "You are like a robot." I said, "I am like a person who learned a lesson." She signed and paid by 10:18 the next morning. I made her cake with steady hands, and it looked like lace because I practiced it 13 times, and I wrote down the time for each tier. We delivered the cake and set it on my reclaimed stand, and the room went soft when the lights hit it. Denise walked in, saw the cake, saw me, and her face did a thing like remembering how to be a person. She walked over and said, "Thank you." The words were simple, but they had weight. I said, "You are welcome," and it felt like smooth wood. Britt cut the cake and took a breath. Like cake could be a fresh start. The reception moved like a train. There were no jokes on the microphone about attention and no speeches about helpers. There was dancing and an uncle who did the worm for 30 seconds and needed a chair, and Lena's husband took a video and we all laughed at the right time. After we packed up the last slice and labeled it for the couple to find in their fridge tomorrow, I stood for a second under the exit sign and Marcus put his arm around my shoulder and said, "We survived your cake on their stage." I said it was just a job. And he said it was more. I said maybe. We drove home in quiet, and I listened to the car hum and the wind, and thought about the way my life had changed. Not in a burst, but in a series of steady clicks. One choice set the hinge. One invoice wrote the ending. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small things. Denise stopped using the word help around me. She said Alina at least twice every visit. Even when she was mad, she sent a thank you text to Marcus after dinner that said chicken was good and conversation was fine. She did not send one to me because she is who she is. And that was okay. I do not need every ribbon to know I finished a race. We made a new normal. Holidays rotated with less drama. I learned to say I am available between 4 and 6 and not 3 to 7. I learned to say I will leave. If the tone is ugly, and then actually leave without slamming a door. I watched Marcus speak up without flinching, and I thanked him later not in a big speech, but in a hand on his back while he did the dishes. The business grew a little more, and I added a second blue binder so my tabs would not burst. I hired a teenage neighbor for dishwashing on event nights, and paid her in cash and a letter for her first job file, because letters matter. One morning, in late fall, I got an email from the HOA board. They wanted to host a neighborhood Thanksgiving and asked if Second Spoon would take it on. 700 people across the afternoon with staggered service. I laughed out loud at the number. And then I said yes with a cap. I asked for clear deposit and a clear schedule, and a clear volunteer plan. And they sent all three. I set up lines and chafers and hand-washing stations and trash sorting with signs in big letters. I printed 200 labels for allergens and 3 extra rolls of tape, and brought a box of hair nets for volunteers who had hair like a waterfall and never wore a hat. I stood on the patio with a radio at my hip and thought I had become the person I needed when I was small and lost in other people's kitchens. In the middle of the crowd, I saw Denise with a paper plate. She looked at me and nodded once like a soldier in a movie, and then she went back to her conversation. That nod was not a hug. It was not an apology. It was not love, but it was a nod, and I took it and put it in my pocket where I keep the small coins of peace. When the last bag of trash was tied and the last table wiped, and the colored lights cut off, I went home and stood at my counter with my navy apron still tied and my feet hot, and I poured a glass of water and looked around my kitchen. I thought about the first day she said, "Help, not family." I thought about the printed policy and the deposit and the late fee, and the clerk who wrote paid and the judge who nodded at paper. I thought about the Rotary lunches and the retirement hugs and the teenager with her first paycheck and the way Jasmine smiles when a service goes smooth. I thought about Marcus and his quiet yes, and the way he stood up at the party and clapped with his hands and with his spine, and I said, "Thank you," out loud, not to a room, not to a person, just into the air like steam. A year passed like a line of plates down the buffet, and I marked it by recipes. Not by fights, lemon chess bars, chili, roast chicken, mac and cheese. I kept the blue binder on a shelf at eye level because I need to see my plan to trust it. On a random Wednesday, I got a text from Denise with a photo of her garden. She wrote, "Do you know what? Ate my basil," and I wrote back, "Probably slugs. Try crushed eggshells and coffee grounds." She replied with a thumbs up, and then after a beat, she wrote, "Thank you, period." I put my phone down and laughed a little because sometimes the twist is not a big reveal. It is a small punctuation mark you did not think you would get. Summer came again, and the pool opened, and the crepe myrtles dropped their papery flowers, and I hosted a backyard cookout for our clinic. We grilled chicken and corn, and a resident doctor brought a potato salad that pooled like a lake. And we ate and laughed, and no one gave a speech. Denise and Gerald walked by with their dog and waved, and I waved back. Later, Marcus said we should invite them next time, and I said, "Maybe. We will see how the tone is this month." He said, "Fair." I sat on the step with my plate and looked at the sky going pink, and I felt a quiet I had made. I knew it could be broken. I knew family is waves, and sometimes the tide returns wild. But I also knew I had learned how to anchor without drowning. The last small thing happened in a bakery aisle where I was choosing flour, and a woman I did not know stopped me and said, "Are you second spoon?" I said yes, and she said, "You catered my neighbor's event," and the labels were so clear and my kid with allergies ate without fear. "Thank you." I smiled and said, "You are welcome." And my eyes stung, and I looked down at the bag of flour and thought about how many loaves it would become, and how many people would eat and not know a single thing about a courtroom or a mean toast or a shiny clutch. They would just know that the food tasted like someone cared and the signs were readable and the kitchen was clean. That was the ending. Not fireworks. Not an apology shouted across a room. Not a final slam of a door. It was a kitchen that worked and a business that paid and a marriage that steadied and a woman who did not let herself be called help, unless she was helping on her terms. I still bring a store cake to family dinners sometimes. I still bite my tongue when a cousin starts to stir the pot in a way that is not about soup. I still write lists and tape them up with blue painter's tape, because that is who I am. When people ask me what happened with my mother-in-law, I say, we learn to live on either side of a line called respect, and every now and then we pass each other a plate across that line, and it is enough. When I lock the service door at the end of a job, the metal clicks, and I feel the same small rush I felt when the court clerk stamped my file paid. It is the sound of the life I chose. I catered the party and sent her the bill, and then I kept going. The revenge was not the check that cleared. It was the habit of standing up and the quiet that followed. It was the way my name sits on my invoices in clean font, and the way my hands smell like lemon and garlic and soap. It was the way a young server learns to set a table with her head up because she watched me do it. It was the way Marcus moves his chair now so I have room to pass behind him with hot pans without bumping my hip. It is the way I can stand in any room, clubhouse or kitchen or courtroom, and say my name in a steady voice. And it means something. It means I am not help, and I am not enemy. I am a woman doing her work with a binder and a boundary and a plan. That is my story, and I am still writing it one menu at a time.